Okay, so now move on to learning. I think this is you again, Patrick.
Well, this is something called learning is a three-step process, not necessarily an action that one would take. But what I think what people don't realise is that learning is definitely a three-step process. We're talking about writing, but we could be talking about anything. We could be talking about learning how to climb a tree or swim or something like that. It doesn't really matter. The process is you practice something, you get feedback from an expert, and then you take action, i.e. you practice again, listening to feedback from the expert. These things sound quite obvious, but what's interesting to me is not looking how it goes right, but also interestingly how it goes wrong. So typically what would happen with a dyslexic or any student is that they'll practice writing. For example, they'll be practicing writing an essay or an exam. Then they get feedback. So they might get feedback from a tutor or a teacher or someone else. Now this is the critical point. Two things go wrong at this point. Number one, the quality of the feedback is not clear enough. And number two, the individual has no curiosity about mistakes, and they don't actually sort of recognize that mistakes are a critical aspect of the learning process. So what would happen is in a normal scenario would be a kid would practice an essay, they would get a D, instructions wouldn't be clear, a bit of a grumpy note from the teacher, must improve the structure, a bit of a grumpy response from the student, obviously messed that one up, let's not really think about it. Now, if you think about what would happen in a perfect scenario, for the feedback to be optimal, the tutor or the teacher would give him not only a forensic understanding of exactly what went wrong, but also a step-by-step understanding of what to improve. And then on the flip side of that coin, the student would have to have some sort of learning philosophy, which a lot of students don't, that mistakes are great things to do, and then they want to make loads of mistakes, and they'll go, oh wow, this is really interesting. I've made a mistake, so this is a great opportunity for me to learn.
I think there's also something you've said before, Patrick, about feedback in an ideal world being in real time, because you don't want the student to get despondent after having put in an essay that they've worked really hard on and got a D or an E. Ideally, you want that feedback to come straight away so they can improve. Is that right?
Absolutely. And, in fact, we're going to talk about, that actually relates to the third thing that we're going to talk about, which is a methodology called talk to write. Now, typically what would happen, if you look at the normal process of what happens, is that a student does an essay or does some homework, gives it to the tutor, gives it to the teacher marks it, gives it back 2 or 3 weeks later on. The student by this point has forgotten it, but it's like, but then they get the poor mark, and all they feel is disappointment. There's not a lot of learning. However, if you could, what we do sometimes with our tutorial sessions, with our, a specific type of methodology that we use, is we have quick fire. So, you can write down the answer, and then the tutor says, actually, there's 6 marks available, and you only got 2 marks out of 6 because you didn't address this point, and you didn't evaluate, and you didn't, point to the date or something like that. And then the tutor will say, okay, and I'd like you to do it again. And that's not as disappointing because, with a teacher doing it, it's slightly disappointing. But if you do it with the tutor, as long as you've instructed the tutor in the right way, they can say, okay, I've got this wrong, but I'm in a minute and a half time, I'm going to have it right. So it's a less sort of disappointing process.
Mm-hmm. And I think that demotivation is a really important problem. So if you can avoid the student getting demotivated, that's absolutely crucial, isn't it?
Yeah, I mean, it's demotivation is a problem because as soon as, and this happens with dyslexics, and they're if they are approaching things in the wrong way and no one's helping them, then their senses, they start to shut off their senses to the world because everything becomes disappointing. And something happens in the subconscious mind is that if everything is becoming disappointing in the outside world, you kind of shut off your senses to the outside world, and that's a bad thing. You want to be very, very alert. If you had a philosophy, and we're going to talk about this in a second, that mistakes are good, then that would, if, and this is another thing that we, that we focus on, that mistakes are great things to make. And it's absolutely critical for every dyslexic to go out there and make as many mistakes as possible. I want dyslexics to go and make mistakes and then really, learn from them and say, oh, okay, I want them to pour over every single mistake. So,
and how can I just butt in, Patrick?
Yeah.
How does a parent or a teacher create that environment for a student?
Well, they need. I mean, we'll be developing dyslexia training in the next few weeks, and part of that dyslexia training is endorsing a learning philosophy, and a critical aspect of the learning philosophy is that they think mistakes are fantastic. It's not like mistakes are great. I don't think oxygen is great. I think oxygen is critical for living. It's the same. I don't think mistakes is an important. I think mistakes are critical. I think an analysis of mistakes are critical for learning. How does that sound to you, Stephen?
I mean, dyslexics always make mistakes. One thing I definitely hate, and I do nowadays, is when someone gives me feedback. But what I like is, and I always tell dyslexics, that when you make a mistake, you need to learn from it, but in a positive style. So for teachers, when, like you were saying earlier on, for example, when a teacher gives feedback, it's normally criticism to a dyslexic. So it's the style of criticism that the teacher needs to give, which is a positive. I often find that dyslexics, and looking back at myself when I was a student, one of my weaknesses was when I made a mistake, I didn't know how to solve it. And when there was criticism, I didn't understand it. And so I often say to tutors, what you need to do is step in before they make the mistake. What I mean by this is, if you're going to ask a student, your class, for homework, I want you to produce, I want you to produce some notes on a video or an article you're going to read. Okay, the first thing a dyslexic is going to do is when they're going to read that article, they're going to forget most of what they're writing. So what the teacher should say is, okay, when they're saying what your homework is, explain how they need to do it. Teachers think, oh, it's just normal, a child will always know how to do it because they've been doing it in class. Well, no, they're failing in class already, so you need to give that experience of how to do the work. For example, study skills. And this goes back to, for example, study plans as well. So, for example, if you said to me, write some notes, I would say the first thing I'd do when I'm reading, I would make some notes on what I was writing, also what I was reading, just some general little points. And then I always say bullet points, but I always write bullet points then from that. So it's like from what Patrick was saying, yes, it's great to give feedback, but from a teaching point of view, I would also try to make it to solve the issue before it happens. And if you give feedback, try to give also examples, not just say this is how you do it by speaking, because dyslexic like, oh, I don't even know how to do it in the first place. Give some examples on paper to say, well, this is how it should look like. So dyslexic has an image of, oh, okay, that's how a report is done. Mm-hmm. This is how an essay should be written. But everyone has a different strategy, but yeah, well, it's always interesting to hear different people's responses.
I think both you and Patrick are coming at it from a very, very similar angle. So
yeah, I mean, just to briefly, to summarise, it's the action that talking about. I think one of the things Stephen was just saying is that they need to be prepped. That's absolutely, the tutor or the teacher needs to feed back in the right way. Yes, they need, and that's absolutely critical. And that's one side of the coin. And the other side of the coin is that if this is one of the things that we're going to be, approaching in our, dyslexia training. If a dyslexic, and I've come across very bright and capable dyslexics had the wrong learning philosophy that a criticism was a bad thing, You know, if they endorse a learning philosophy that mistakes are good, then only that point then can they take the third step, which is the action, which is to say, oh, okay, this is an interesting mistake. I've made this mistake, and therefore let's change this action. And therefore, a lot of the time you can see we never get to 3. We never get to, because at the feedback point, people kind of shut their eyes like, oh, I don't want to hear this. And in fact, that's the thing that we really need to open our eyes to is, that, oh, okay. And we're going to get, one of the things I would say is, let's work with the dyslexia training thing that we're going to be creating in a few weeks. But also, even if you have a very critical teacher who is not aware of this, I think dyslexics would really benefit from, say they get, trashed in an essay. The teacher says, oh, you must do better, F minus. Go and talk to that. Say, okay, that's really interesting. Go and talk to that, grumpy old teacher and say, look, I'm not really clear about how can I do it in the future. And the teacher will go, okay, he's actually taking, from the teacher's perspective, he's probably, marked hundreds of scripts that day and he's in a bit of a grumpy mood. He might say, okay, this student's really making an effort, and then he might give you 5 minutes. That 5 minutes is critical.
Okay, thanks. That's some really good advice there from both presenters. Okay, we're going to move on now